Once again, I want to thank Angela Stent and CERES and Georgetown for hosting us all at this conference. I'm EUGENE RUMER from the National Intelligence Council, and I'm a marginal player on this panel, both literally and figuratively speaking. And I'm delighted to introduce this panel, people I've known for a long time, who are true experts in the field of Eurasian energy. THANE GUSTAFSON, who teaches here at Georgetown and hardly needs any introductions. He's got a new book out on Russian oil, and I'm sure he'll speak about it in his presentation. BRENDA SHAFFER, who is a one-time colleague of mine at the Washington Institute and a long-time student of Caspian Energy. And PAVEL BAEV, a colleague of many years, a fellow attendee at many conferences, and a very thoughtful observer of Russian security and energy trends. So without taking up any more time from the panel, I'll turn the microphone, figuratively speaking again, to THANE, who will kick us off with his thoughts on Russian energy, or rather Russian oil.
Thank you very much, Eugene, and good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here. And I will not talk about my book, save to follow Daniel Yergin's first law, which is waive the book. So now that I've done that, I have borrowed, however, the title because I think it sums up very nicely the current state of affairs in Russian oil. And it's, of course, a cliche of our business to say that Russia is at a crossroads. But I think you'll agree after I've zipped through this collection of slides, and I'm going to go very quickly because the file is available through CERES, and we can send a PDF version to anyone who asks for it. But there are four key challenges facing the Russian oil industry, and the crossroads metaphor, I think, applies very much. Because for the last 20 years, the Russians have been essentially working the legacy inherited from the Soviet Union. Now, one has to qualify that, and of course, there's no such thing really as easy oil, and so there's been a tremendous amount of work in very trying times. But nevertheless, here we are. The headline is that the legacy is beginning to run down, and the question is, what happens next? And so I've summarized that as four key challenges. The first one is what's going to happen after 2015, particularly over the 5 years from 2015 to 2020. And the basic picture to keep in mind here is that of a race. And I'm not going to take you through all the details, but I want to simply give you the broad picture and the metaphor of a race between a decline in what is in shorthand called the brownfields, that is to say broadly the inherited assets that were already in production and under development at the time of the end of the Soviet Union, and the new fields that are being developed, particularly outside the traditional perimeter of the industry, chiefly in West Siberia and Volga-Urals. These terms, of course, always need to be qualified. For example, when you talk about brownfields, the brownest of brownfields are in the Volga-Urals basin, which was the workhorse of the Soviet oil industry in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And the extraordinary headline from the Volga-Urals is that the decline has been reversed, and this is an area in which production is actually growing. So this is an area that should be looked at, and which some experts are already looking at. But broadly, this picture applies very much that it's the competition between the rate of onset of production from a handful of new fields and the steady decline of the West Siberian fields broadly. And so that's the shape of the challenge. Which of these two tendencies is going to prevail between now and 2020, or even between now and 2030? But the broader issue that I want to put before you is that the real challenge stems from the fact that as you move out of the comfort zone of the legacy assets, you're moving into areas that are variously deeper, more sour, high pressure, more complex geologically, but above all, more remote. You have to move into colder regions. You have to move into regions in which there is no infrastructure that is already developed. And the consequence is higher costs. Now, this is a reality, of course, for any extractive industry. In any extractive industry, the iron law is the law of diminishing returns. And you fight the diminishing returns with improved efficiency and improved technology. And you hope that you can keep your costs down. And of course, you pray that commodity prices will remain high. And so you carry on. But it's like running uphill. And the uphill gets steeper and steeper as you run. And it's more and more of a challenge. And that is the shape of what the Russian oil industry has to contend with, especially since over the previous 20 years, much of the revenue flow was essentially pure rent because the investments had already been made in another time, in another country, and were inherited. Now the industry is going to have to invest big time in developing the next generation of oil, and that adds an element of cost, which was not there previously. And so it's practically mathematical, practically a certainty that overall costs are going to go up. Now that has tremendous implications for the prime shareholder of the Russian oil industry, namely the state, because the trend in the Russian government, as you know, is toward steadily increasing budgets and steadily increasing burdens, spending commitments. Some of them due to the demography. Russia has a graying population. Some of them due to the simple wearing out of the infrastructure, also inherited from the Soviet period. Some of it has to do with policy objectives adopted by the present leadership, and in particular, a fast rate of growth of military spending. These have been controversial, as you know. There is a certain amount of leeway that the Russian government has. It can sequester, it can hold back. Nevertheless, the trend is toward increasing government expenditure and this is the key point, an increasing reliance on the oil and gas sector. Now over 50% of the revenues of the Russian government come from the export of gas and oil. A degree of dependence, by the way, which is greater than that of the Soviet Union. The third challenge stems from the fact that the relationship between the industry and the state has never really been reformed. What we remember, or what we think we remember from the 1990s, is that the Russian oil industry managed a clean getaway and went private. In actual fact, it wasn't a clean getaway, and indeed it wasn't even a getaway. And indeed it's not even private. So those are the three big reservations that leave the Russian oil industry with an extremely uncomfortable and in many ways fluid relationship with the state, and it's not a friendly relationship on the whole. Taxes, and I won't go into taxes or I'll lose the whole audience. With mine eyes glaze over very quickly when oil taxes come along, but nevertheless it's absolutely crucial. If there is tax reform, then the job gets easier. But so far there has been no more than symbolic tax reform. Diversity. As the pieces came down, the Russians went with large integrated oil companies, and that is not necessarily the most efficient way to go. Think about the structure of the United States in the lower 48, where over half of the production comes from small companies, so-called independents, and these are the ones that have been driving the so-called tight oil miracle. And above all, there has been very little foreign participation. If you look here, this summarizes the story. At this moment, foreign oil companies produce less than 5% of Russian oil. That is to say, not as shareholders, not as portfolio investors, but as direct hands-on players. And much of that is from the PSAs that were negotiated in the 1990s that began production in the 2000s, but there will be no more of those, or at least on the horizon there are no more of those. So that needs to be addressed. But the main thing that I want to focus on is the question of the tight oil revolution, which has come out of North America. Unexpectedly, a total surprise, in the last 5 years or so, the United States has been going through a revolution in the lower 48, a region that we thought of as mature, holding no surprises, we thought. And yet, the biggest surprise in the energy world is first the shale gas revolution, and then just next door, the tight oil revolution. The point I want to make about it is that many people still think of shale oil as being similar to shale gas. Until recently, the Russians have. But in actual fact, what's going on is a widening revolution that is now affecting all of the hard-to-produce areas of the lower 48. And let me just click a few to give you a sense of the widening scope. And then as you look at this production forecast, it is absolutely extraordinary that as you add all of these fields one to another, all of them difficult to produce, many of them in production, some of them in production for decades, you get an expectation of some 5 million barrels a day of additional oil from these, shall we say, difficult, borderline unconventional, conventional fields in the lower 48 of the United States. And this is now thought to be a conservative estimate. So what are the lessons from shale oil in the United States? The first is precisely as I've said. It's not shale. It's all of the difficult conventional. The second is that it's far more than about geology and technology. The real lesson is on a customized basis, you crack the code field by field as you develop a tailor-made approach. And by the way, this has been where the independents have really been on their preferred playing field. And the main point, the key point, and the one that really resonates for the Russians is the challenges are above the ground. Just to elaborate on the point about the technology, because I'm often asked whether it's technology that's the challenge. And the answer is that the basic techniques have been spreading into Russia and have been taken over by Russian service companies almost as soon as they have arrived on shore. And so that's not the obstacle. So to repeat the key point, the challenges will be above the ground. When the Russians first heard about shale oil, the Bakken, they immediately said, aha, shale, we have shale. In fact, boy, do we have shale. We have Bazhanov, the Bazhanov substructure that underlies the entire West Siberian Basin. That's about twice the area of France, right there. That's a lot of source rock. The question is, has it matured into hydrocarbons, or is it still the predecessor, as they call kerogen, not yet ready to produce? Come back in another 10 million years, and we can talk. So the Russians are going forward with the Bazhanov because that's their first perception of where the tight oil challenge lies. And so there's activity there, which I will not go into detail on, except to say that the Bazhanov is best described as what the Russians call a cat in a bag, a kot v mishke, the translation of which is a pig in a poke. This must have mystified a number of people when I was quoted in the paper the other day as saying that the Bazhanov was a pig in a poke. I hope I didn't offend anybody. All it means is that it's a kot v mishke. But the real question is whether the unconventional challenge is going to go forward, as in the United States, because that's the part where you could really get returns very quickly. And so I'll skip over the pros simply to go to the point that we're seeing the Russian oil companies already go after the conventional, unconventional in a number of respects. And this is the thing to watch. So watch Lukoil's West Siberian initiatives. Watch TNK-BP. Oops, what TNK-BP? Now that is going to be an interesting question right there, because TNK-BP arguably was the technological leader for the Russian oil industry in recent years. But will it, in fact, continue to serve that function? Or will it be completely integrated and disappear? That's one of the biggest questions in front of us. Finally, what about the other way to go? That other next generation thing, which is the shelf, the Arctic shelf. And as you can imagine, the debate is raging in Moscow right now between those who say, look, we've got a near-term opportunity. Look what the Americans are doing. And then you're talking about going after something that's going to produce in 20 years, and it may be gas, and it's going to cost a fortune. That's a no-brainer. And yet, at this moment, Russian oil policy is going in both directions. At the center of this is Rosneft. And Rosneft at this moment is the largest oil company in the world. It's far and away the largest oil company in Russia. It is also a company that has a great deal on its plate and the most tremendous gearing in the business. This company is creaking under its debt. It is an unproven management structure. It has someone who's new to the industry as its CEO, and it has the most incredible shopping list of things that it has to do by tomorrow. This is quite a challenge. So watch Rosneft, watch this story unfolding. It'll be a Rosneft story above all. The Russians have very little experience in the offshore, and so everything depends on the quality of the partnerships that Rosneft has concluded with a new series of strategic allies, and first and foremost with ExxonMobil. And so that too is the thing to watch. Not just on the offshore, but increasingly ExxonMobil and Rosneft are partnering up to go after the tight oil prospects as well. Finally, the Russians themselves have been developing an offshore capability. Suffice it to say that Gazprom has taken 20 years to build a platform that is still not underway. And that simply underscores how vital it is to have that industrial support, which at this moment the Russians do not have. And so I'll conclude simply with my favorite saying, which comes from Valery Greifer, the grand old man of West Siberian oil industry, the man who, at the peak of his career in the mid-1980s, controlled single-handedly 8 million barrels a day of production. And Valery Greifer likes to say, the Iron Curtain didn't go down. It went up. And that's a wonderful way of looking at it. But then you have to add, it hasn't finished going up yet. So, thank you very much. Спасибо за внимание.
Okay, last year we marked 20 years to the Soviet breakup and the independence of the states of Central Asia and the Caucasus that enabled the re-establishment of Caspian energy production. And this year and next year we're marking 20 years to the major PSAs that brought the involvement of a number of Western companies into these industries. So I'd like to take this opportunity of sort of a 20-year perspective to look at what are the lessons from Caspian, first round of Caspian energy production, and what are the lessons for our second round as we're looking forward. What are the implications for other energy projects in general, and what are the implications for international politics? And a second question I'd like to ask during this presentation is that, as Dr. EUGENE pointed out correctly in his presentation and also in the quest, there was rarely a pipeline project or some sort of oil export that there was so much high-level political involvement and debate as Caspian phase one. It's basically, especially from Azerbaijan, but also to a certain extent from Kazakhstan. No, I don't think even Keystone has not attracted the attention, of so many high-level American officials, so many speeches. I mean, we have 3 U.S. presidents that have took a stand on the BTC. Every Secretary of State in the 90s took a stand. When do you ever remember any pipeline project that was so important to U.S. officials? And it's kind of a puzzling thing when you think of how small the volumes are of Caspian oil and gas, relative to the high-level involvement. So I would like to ask, what is the U.S. cared a lot about the Caspian in the 1990s, and as we're sitting here in 2013, should the U.S. really still care about the Caspian, or in an era of massive changes in oil and gas markets around the world, should actually this be more of a historical matter than something of the future? So as I said, there was never been a pipeline project, a oil or gas export. There was such a talked about incident as a Caspian energy. Everything from these overused phrases, new great game, Silk Road. We put so many labels on something that was quite simple. And again, the volumes seem to, the gap between the amount of activity versus the small volumes almost is quite puzzling. Many thought that this was a struggle to put a flag on oil, and as you know, that most actually even national oil companies, most companies don't bring oil home. There's really very little meaning to put a flag on oil barrels. The markets do their deal. No one's ever in the last 30 years tried to buy a barrel of oil and wasn't able to buy that barrel of oil. And even if you manage to put the flag on the oil, you still have to get it through sea lanes, and most of them are controlled by the US, and even most countries, including China, are very happy that the US controls those sea lanes. So it doesn't really matter much to put a flag on the oil. So what was all this Caspian jockeying about? And it was about giving opportunities to the states of the region to set their own political and strategic paths. It wasn't about the volumes, but it was about these countries having the options of not being dependent on their neighbors. And this is where we have a number of lessons, is that one, that politics matters. And I think a big part of the debate, Diane was an actor during that debate in 1990s. A lot of people that are sitting in the room actually were people that were part of this debate. The companies were constantly saying, let the markets decide. Commercial considerations should decide. And we see this in a lot of energy debates, whether it's our fuel mix, whether it's how much renewables, in Europe they're having a debate right now on how the markets should be organized and managed. That markets should decide. And Caspian oil was actually something different, where we said, no, energy affects politics, and therefore politics should have a say. And we see that in very challenging, that markets aren't enough. Even in the United States, you're having a debate right now with all the huge amounts of oil and gas, sort of something that might be if someone's looking for a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation topic. There's a real interesting debate going on security of supply within the United States. It's not enough that you have enough volumes of gas and gasoline and fuels, but getting it to proper places around the United States. Anyone who comes from New England, when you see the Boston Harbor close every time an LNG shipment comes in, you might be thinking, wait, isn't Pennsylvania kind of close? But yet, because you don't have the pipeline infrastructure in the United States, so you're having even debates, how do we get those supplies to different physical places? Another sort of secret thing that's going on, why gasoline prices have such a diversity in the United States, again, it's connected to moving it from place to place. It's not enough that it's within a country. And that we see that, especially in the case of gas, if you don't have storage and backup, and redundancies of infrastructure. You're seeing in the UK, where they're basically having a debate about, will the lights go out in 6 to 7 years if they continue this with this system that's really on the edge of its capacity. And we see that without political involvement, you don't have security of supply. And so we would like to say, this, again, the markets do great things. We probably would not have the shale gas revolution if it wasn't for the private market and letting it run on its own. On the other hand, there's certain things markets don't do on their own. And so we see that there was a great political involvement in Caspian Energy, and there are some lessons that if we want those more challenging projects, we want security of supply, it can be oil or in gas, you need some political involvement. At the same time, we shouldn't overestimate the political meaning. And I think many of the states of the region, many policymakers in Europe and the United States thought that we could use Caspian Energy to build peace pipelines. I mean, we have no precedent in the literature that you have two warring countries and you say, wait, okay, stop, soldiers here, minefields there, BP's coming through with the tractors. Sorry, Greg. And that pipelines can create peace between neighbors. If at all, I could tell someone who has been working on Eastern Mediterranean gas, actually gas supplies as between Israel and Egypt, they can actually cause conflict between states, not actually preserve the peace. We had congressmen, EU officials trying to use these pipelines to shape the peace of the region. And we have, again, I've done a lot of study on this. You have no precedent where you have warring countries and pipelines become an incentive for peace. They can, if there's peace, you can actually get pipelines, but they're not going to incentivize the peace. And the countries of the region, I think Azerbaijan had certain expectations that this would take a Western interest in solving its conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. Georgia thought that being a major transit state of Caspian Energy, this would give a Western interest in its stability and its peace. And we see that no, that there was a level to how important this was to the Western powers and how much how far this could go. On On the other hand, we do see, for instance, and I think that something that Caspian shows even more, that there really is no oil weapon. That if at all there's an oil weapon, someone who could use oil supplies in order to coerce behavior of countries, is actually in the hands of consumers. Consumers can deny markets to oil producers, but producers can't deny oil because that's their lifeline. And if they do, someone else will also sell it to you. So we really see that how little translation there is of being an oil exporter to political influence. I did a big study on this actually in the sphere of gas, which is much more nuanced. Happy to refer some of the students to it. Again, also on conflicts, I think Caspian Energy, the first round, also debunks a lot of the myths connected to pipelines and regional conflicts. Just like it didn't stabilize the countries, on the other hand, you don't need a lot of stability in order to launch an energy export project. So maybe East Africa or Eastern Mediterranean gas will do okay despite what's happening in the region. You know, that if there's the commercial incentives, then even if things are not completely stable and completely safe, these projects can work. So a lot of people thought, how will we have a BTC, you know, this kind of skirts Armenia and goes through Kurdish areas, and yet these projects were quite stable. As a caveat, I would agree completely with the assessment of, I think it was Matt here, that we're awash in oil and gas, and I think companies can be a lot pickier right now. They're not going to go to places that are as tricky, probably as something like where there are wars close to or being engaged, or where there's tricky geography like in the Caspian, although they will stay in the Caspian. That brings me to the point of geography, and that it's a point that, it's kind of sad. The next point I'm going to make is something that is so true and so obvious, but yet it's one that's very highly debated right now in international relations. It's almost, I don't know, it's quite puzzling to me, but it's the geography matters. And so many of you are maybe students of international relations. There's big debates going on. Sort of one poll is Robert Kaplan, another one is Anne-Marie Slaughter, but a number of people in this debate. Does it really matter, physical constraints? Are we in this era where when we have interconnectivity and we have Google Flu and we have Google and Smell now and social networking, does it really matter next to who you're located, or if you're landlocked and don't have sea access? And I think Caspian Energy, but again and again, it's kind of blowing up in our face, that how come, yes, the world is unequal, and sometimes you're born next to a very big power, sometimes you're born next to an unstable country, sometimes you're not born with sea access, and states have different challenges. So we see that the landlocked geography of the Caspian, that's why Caspian oil, one of the reasons why it captured our attention, it was a lot more like gas. Because it didn't have they didn't have sea access, and it couldn't just go to open markets. You had to cement political relations. You had to build permanent infrastructure. It acted more like a major mega gas project. This is why we see Georgia as being so central, and why it isn't puzzling that we've had so many wars and attempts centered around Georgia. If you look at a map of the Caspian, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, all the countries are landlocked except for Georgia. It's basically like a human body. If you grab the throat, you grab Georgia. You don't really care what's happening with the arms and legs. So Georgia is a key country to whatever outcomes happen in the Caspian. So it has been and will remain key. And so with the election results and some of the turnovers in Georgia, of course, this has incredible implications for the Caspian. Another point that we're seeing coming out of Caspian is how much grades of oil, the spread in pricing, is becoming almost permanent. We used to think those kind of differences in grades of oil, there was always some amount, but actually it's spreading to almost unprecedented rounds. In 2013, Azerbaijani oil premium was $3 above the Brent price. It's a huge spread, and it doesn't seem to be changing as some refineries are becoming more specialized, as certain markets are focusing on certain types of products. So there's more demand for certain types of oil versus others. So when you think of something like a Libya going offline or something happening in Azerbaijan, not every barrel of oil is the same. An additional point is the importance of transit states. It's important in terms of landlocked Caspian oil, but it's generally in terms of gas. That probably the most destabilizing factor of energy transport on land is connected to transit states. Even when they're your Turkish brother in Azerbaijan, you can have huge debates over transit, over price, have transit states generally try, if there's someone along the line that tries to use their positions, the transit states, because they're, obviously whoever's contracting the oil or the gas wants it, whoever's selling it wants it, but the ones along the line are the ones that tend to spice it up a bit in order to improve their role. So any project you're looking at with involvement of transit states is going to be less stable than others. So looking forward, what are some of the things that are going to happen in the next round? If Caspian 1 was about oil, Caspian 2 will be about a little more oil from Kazakhstan, but basically the next stage is about Caspian gas, especially Azerbaijan. Turkmenistan, tremendous, we'll hear about it the afternoon, but the volumes are growing almost every year, the assessments. It's incredible how much is happening there, and still no really big utilization of for export. The region is less anxious for FDI than it was in the 1990s, so the countries are going to be much more selective. They're going to take their time. They're going to want much more involvement of the local people in leadership roles. You see completely different role if you take, like, for instance, SOCAR, the National Oil Company of Azerbaijan. It went from a junior player in the 1990s, basically listening to the Western companies, to actually the leader in these projects. And also some of the local oil companies are going from national oil companies to international oil companies, having activity outside their native region. Georgia will certainly still be central to the outcomes of the region. If you want to know what can go forward, you have to see also how stable Georgia is and what its orientation is. The region itself, and this relates to the previous panel, the region itself is becoming a major consumers of natural gas. It's not just about exporting the gas, it's actually using the gas correctly in the region, even more acute in Central Asia, where really they have blackouts and really lack of stable supplies, but energy consumption is growing in Azerbaijan, it's growing in Georgia, it's growing in Turkey. So these will not just be places to transit gas through, but they will be consumers of gas. Turkey, by the way, one of the biggest, fastest growing electricity markets in the world. There's a lot of lessons here for other landlocked production that we're thinking about: South Sudan, Kurdistan, Uganda, Bolivia, even Canadian Rockies, which we should think about as landlocked production. It's more challenging, it's more political, it needs a different type of commitment than other type of production. It entires completely different political relations with their neighbors, because these projects have to go through the neighboring states. Well, the question I opened was, should the Caspian matter? After all this, again, we're awash with oil and gas. Do we really need this complicated landlocked gas for the Caspian? And I would say yes. One, oil prices, as we know, the prices are set in the margins. It's that last million barrels. It's not just the whole big picture. And so any more you can squeeze out of the Caspian, we have security of supply. It doesn't matter energy independence, where it comes from. We can get oil, but we have no security of price. And if you want to get oil prices down, it's that last million barrels. It's not just if you have enough oil for your market. And I'm a little intimidated to make a statement on this with Dan Jurgen in the room, but I'm actually going to do that. I know it could be a little suicidal here, but I think that he discussed the whole idea of where we're going in terms of how shale gas is going to influence markets or market. And actually, you could take, basically gas is completely different than anything with oil. We have gas markets. It's very much connected to the local. Each area has its price dynamics and its supply and consumption options. And shale gas could actually build you a case for either scenario. Meaning you could say, well, since we're going to have oil and gas in so many different places, and so many more places consuming big quantities of gas and producing big quantities of gas, won't it start looking like oil and become a global market? And you could make the exact opposite argument, that simply because we're going to have so much pipeline gas available in so many new locations, maybe LNG might become a boutique, expensive type fuel that we won't actually, and its consumption will go down. And I would say that for sure, I actually tend to think that until we have a major change in the price gap between production of LNG and pipeline, then we're not going to have a global market in LNG or a truly global market in LNG. But at least we can agree that it will take a long time till we get there. So Caspian gas, it might not be important for California, but it certainly is important for Southern Europe, potentially for Central Europe. And so it does mean a lot in its local area. It doesn't mean a lot necessarily for the globe. So my last point, and I actually will finish at this point, is that consequently, if the United States wants to reap a lot of those benefits of all those meetings, of all those summits, of all those statements of Madeleine Albright and President Clinton, and did actually do something quite bold and gave these countries an opportunity to set their own path and be part of Euro-Atlantic structures and to be allies of the United States. And if the US wants to make sure that a few million barrels a day are getting to markets and having a soothing influence on prices, and the Caspian gas is getting to proper markets in Europe, the US needs to have a policy, needs to have a role. I'm not so sure it's just because it's about gas. I think because the US in a certain sense isn't caring enough about what's happening in a lot of arenas around the world, but maybe we can debate that. Thank you.
It's a great privilege to be at this conference, and I'm really biting my nails that I wasn't here 10 years ago. So the ambition is to get invited to the next one. And it's with that ambition I've chosen that title, because one might say, you know, Arctic is a colossal territory to cover in 15 minutes. Why to bring Europe also in this? And I would try to show that there is a very peculiar parallelism, that in that battle between Brussels and Moscow, which Daniel was describing, Arctic is in fact a very important theater, maybe even a hostage, you would say. And it's a peculiar kind of battle because both parties in the battle are in denial of very important changes or revolution in the energy market. And yesterday I was walking around watching cherry trees and stepped into Jefferson Memorial and saw a quote there: "I am not afraid of new inventions." And I'm not sure at all that in Moscow the energy minister or Gazprom chief executive or Putin himself might repeat that, because the new inventions in the energy market might bring exactly that. And it's not the old energy world of $20 per barrel, it's a new energy world. It's back to the future. There is a colossal scare in Moscow. The innovation might lead there. As far as Brussels is concerned, it's a different set of anxieties and fears about innovations, because the bureaucrats in Brussels have invested heavily. They committed themselves to innovations and improvements that don't work. Into renewables, that is, they can work very well in the environment of subsidies and preferences. They cannot work in the age of austerity. So there is a lot of anxiety in Brussels about that, but fortunately I don't need to answer for them. I will stick to Russia. It's quite enough, I suppose. And where should I aim at that? The question which now looms large is this one. And in parallel, we can also ask where Russia's energy policy is going. And it's a natural thing to look for the answers in all the articles and all the new documents that are produced at the start of Putin's new presidency. He wrote a series of articles, and you will try to look there, what about energy? There is hardly a word. And if you look at Russia's new foreign policy concept published last month, and look what about Arctic? And in the Arctic is mentioned deep in the document where their kind of regional priorities are described. It's a regional priority, if I am not wrong, some number 74, something like that. So suddenly you don't see any answer to that question, and you might suspect that there are really no guidelines either for energy policy or fresh ideas about the Arctic policy. There is a lot of confusion. And with Arctic, staying with Arctic, it's clear where the kind of suddenly the explosion of interest happened. It was in the mid-2000s, after this famous flag planting expedition, where Russia suddenly discovered it has a position of strength, that it is, by all intents and purposes, the Arctic superpower. It has kind of more people beyond in the Arctic than all the other Arctic states taken together. It has more economic potential there. It has more icebreakers. It certainly has hugely more military potential there. There is a position of strength. The question is only how to use it. And Russia was kind of experimenting this way and that way. And in parallel, surprisingly, it also discovered a position of energy strength vis-à-vis Europe. That was really the point where Russia felt itself to be an energy superpower and was looking forward to finding a use, political use, of this energy strength. And that's fairly recent, 2007 and 8 and 9 and 10. And I would argue that the year 2012 was really a breaking point, a turning point in both of these trains of thought. Yes, with the Arctic policy, and that's probably kind of the only relevant quote from all Putin's publications, while Arctic not specifically mentioned, and that's in fact the picture he has himself chosen. I'm not sure it's very complimentary. That was kind of the idea that we have strength in the Arctic, we can develop that and cultivate, that we can find a way to exploit that position of strength. And that strength essentially came from two key elements, from the energy and from the military. And how they interplay is often very difficult to say. What sort of connection is there in the Supreme Head is hard to figure out. And that's a quote from his election trail where he was asked about the safety on the Northern Sea route, which is becoming usable again because of the global warming. Global warming, one place where it's very visible is in the Arctic. And that was his answer. And I cannot explain you what possible connection might be between nuclear submarines and the safety of navigation on the Northern Sea route, but there is obviously a connection in that head. Interplay between the military and the energy in the Arctic has been and remains very peculiar, and both, in fact, bring very serious risks. That picture is about the nuclear submarine with a full complement of strategic missiles that caught fire, undergoing very minor repairs outside Murmansk in the last days of December 2011. The accident was didn't happen, but the scale of the scare was colossal. I will not go into military risk, I will stick with the energy. That is Prirazlomnaya, one project where Arctic is not about gas, but about oil. And Gazprom Neft took over that project about 10 years ago and wanted a quick fix. The project was in big trouble. While it's not deep water, it's shallow water, it's not far from, of course, it's close. Nevertheless, it went for a quick fix, and the quick fix turned out to be first extremely expensive, and then not quick at all, and secondly, not a fix, thirdly. So it's still not working, and they are not able really to ensure that the environmental risks are properly addressed, because somehow in the whole colossal empire of Gazprom, expertise on that is extremely thin. So with the Arctic, risks are high, and the dividends are in fact pretty low. It was visible for a few years that Putin has developed a particular passion for Arctic. He was going there to different places, petting the polar bears sedated with an elephant dose of drugs. It was going to Franz Josef Land in the very far north and enjoying the very particular landscape consisting of colossal number of empty barrels, which is the most distinctive feature there, and ordering this cleanup. But nevertheless, every time he comes to these occasions, like that on that station where he was discussing matters with climatologists, with international stations which were dealing with climate change, and he conveyed to them a very important piece of information that the value of natural resources in the Arctic is $5 trillion of the United States. how is that calculated? It's impossible to say. What is added to what sort of estimates are behind that, and what is the relevance of this information to climatologists? Again, problematic to say. Nevertheless, the very particular interest from Putin was there. And underpinning that interest definitely was the idea that, yes, Arctic is extremely rich with natural resources. And the proof positive of that is definitely on the Yamal Peninsula. So that idea that the big energy heart of Europe is moving from here to here was kind of behind all that. And to all intents and purposes, this is Arctic. Arctic is not only offshore. The whole Yamal Peninsula is up there. So in Russian perceptions, Arctic is not only about the sea, it's also about the land. And that was one project which Gazprom has successfully brought to implementation. They know how to do that in these conditions. So Bovanenkovskaya gas field there is now producing, is now pumping the gas and kind of pumping it in the direction of Europe. That was supposed to be a kind of great success. It was supposed to be a turning point in this whole Arctic saga, and it isn't. And it isn't because Russia is suddenly discovering that it's trapped in saturated European market. And I have to come clean about that slide. She didn't really do that yesterday. It is a Photoshop. But I bet she wanted. So the graph shows you the market shares of Gazprom. And you might see that their price now is about a third of what they used to be. So Bovanenkova was not a turning point here at all. It is a success story of sorts. Again, it was delayed and so on, but no visible impression on the market share at all. And I can say that Rosneft is doing a little better, but not very much better. So while Russian economy has recovered from the crisis, the market tells you a slightly different story about all that. And as far as energy is concerned, yes, that's the situation that all the Russian kind of energy bosses, including the big one, are finding themselves now in. It is a kind of self-made trap. Yes, there is more export, particularly oil, that goes now east, but this is the market where they really want it to be, and the market is contracting. And there are kind of colossal amount of problems that Gazprom is facing on that market, and Putin is forced to waste his political capital on that again and again and again, and no politicians love that, wasting his capital. And so there is a very visible shift in Putin's priorities and political attention overall, from gas back to oil. Oil is becoming more important. That's where the money comes from. That's where kind of less problems are shaping up, less troubles, and again, probably still money matters more than anything else. And another turning point in 2012 was definitely this one. It was far less important project for Gazprom than Bovanenkova, but it was a kind of an experiment that should kind of be a test for the ability to adjust to this new, brave, new energy world Daniel was talking about. And the experiment produced a result, a very predictable result. It failed. And, well, I think last year I very heartily congratulated Statoil for getting out of that particular trap. They are really very happy because there were a lot of worries in Statoil how Moscow would respond. We would say we're getting out of this project. What would be the political reaction? None. And because in Moscow suddenly they are discovering that it's not kind of an isolated project. It is a part of the whole developing European story, and that's where, in particular, the Arctic development and the European energy market intersect. That yes, sure, kind of the colossal gas field is still there, and sometime in the future its turn will come, but it's far beyond the political horizon. it's, for that matter, of no political interest whatsoever. And from that, another discovery comes that Arctic is not really that promising as far as energy is concerned. That all these inflated assessments about how rich Arctic is, all these $5 trillion calculated on some sort of inflated assessment and inflated prices, they look carefully at what is mapped as what is expected, where primarily gas, and some of them in a very difficult condition, operational costs, this and that, far more attractive indeed to go into tight oil in the well-developed areas like Volga-Urals, even the Caucasus, where infrastructure is there and the technology is coming from the Western partners and costs can be kept under control, than to experiment with the Arctic. And that was kind of another big part of the Arctic policy. The very emotionally important, symbolically important idea of expanding a Russian continental shelf. And that's not, in fact, an artifact. I could have drawn a better map, but that what was a real one which was submitted to the UN Commission on the Delimitation of Continental Shelf back in 2001 and was duly turned back for kind of for improvement, for more research, for a better proof. And since then, everybody and the dog has submitted new claim to that commission, and Russia is still contemplating. Russia is still scratching its head, still preparing, because not only because there are legal technicalities there. Yes, there are, and it's very difficult, in fact, to provide all the kind of solid research data, particularly when all your scientific research is focused on proving your claim, which is in itself a compromising thing. But also because there is a better understanding that the claim can be successful only if kind of a solid cooperation in the Arctic with the neighbors is established. Only if kind of all the interested parties are coming to that commission together. And Russia is indeed trying very hard to be a good Arctic neighbor. And probably the most tangible proof of that was the treaty with Norway about delimitation of the maritime border. An agreement which is hugely unpopular with large part of Russian political elite and with the public opinion, nevertheless signed and ratified as a kind of an attempt to establish a new atmosphere of cooperation in the Arctic and get this project accomplished with expanding Russian continental shelf, which again is not that much about energy. It's much more about identity, it's much more about kind of political importance of all that. And when we ask whether this attempt to build Arctic cooperation will succeed, we cannot look only on the Arctic matters. We have also look at that. And I find it very easy to identify with that guy sitting in the Moscow cafe and looking outside. You probably cannot see it very well. It's a big glass in the cafe, like in Starbucks. And outside, all these stormtroops, all these OMON forces are marching. And it's not a very comfortable idea to go out of your cafe into the street. You know, it's not very tempting. But the moment you sit there, drink your coffee and think about it, you are suddenly becoming on the other side of the barricade. You are with the thinking class. And the opposition there is growing. And with all the best effort at building cooperation, Russia is still drifting into self-isolation. That is kind of the reality of nowadays. And in this, on this track, it's hard to expect great successes in building cooperation, whether in the Arctic or to resolve your energy problem with Europe, or indeed to launch a meaningful reset 2.0 with the United States. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for very provocative and very informed and informative presentations. I will take advantage of having the microphone at the moment and ask the first question. And the question really is to all three of you. The picture you describe both in terms of what you said and what you didn't say, is really quite bleak for Eurasian energy. THANE, you point, in my view, very aptly, but since I consider myself to be a student of yours here, maybe there's a case of circular reporting here in a sense, but you point to key obstacles to Russian energy development being really above ground. It's the taxes, it's the ownership structure, it's the barriers to entry for new capital, and so on and so forth. So that's one. Pavel, you echoed many of the themes in more general terms raised by THANE with respect to the Arctic, pointing both to the rather unpromising climate, both figuratively and literally speaking, and the technical and probably political obstacles that stand in the way of energy development in the Arctic overall. And Brenda, something that you didn't say, but sort of combining what you didn't say with what you said, it looks like there is not going to be a renaissance, or a renaissance in Caspian energy is an uphill struggle in a sense, because the attention of the key geopolitical players has shifted elsewhere, and the countries themselves have not really created the conditions that are so important for new capital, new companies to come in, and for the existing players to really increase their commitment, their involvement in the Caspian. You mentioned Turkmenistan and the vast potential that it holds, increasingly vast potential that it holds, but it's been holding that vast potential for a long time, and we've all been looking for potentially promising signs for a Trans-Caspian pipeline. It has yet to come. Is the bottom line that I'm drawing from your observations really a correct one? Or am I missing something here, and you see perhaps factors that are not necessarily on the horizon that could really propel Eurasia into a more promising place with respect to energy development? And Thane, you've talked, I've heard you speak about many ways in which Russian state companies, Gazprom in particular, are not really deaf and blind to the energy revolution. Are they learning? Are they looking at the Western experience? Are they taking away lessons from the revolution that Dan described for us in his keynote address? Brenda, are you seeing signs of it in the Caspian, that Caspian leaders perhaps are coming around and realizing that they need to do more than just accept offers from Western companies? I'm, of course, exaggerating somewhat here, but and Pavel, after all, some of the biggest, most promising potentially energy development or overall investment projects in Russia in the past few years really have been in the Arctic. So again, is there something here that really requires a more in-depth look, and maybe perhaps there's a more promising picture in the future? And I'll leave it up to you to take it in however order you want to pursue it.
Well, let me lead off. I guess we're on the air. Yeah, we have our mics. I think the question of whether one is optimistic or pessimistic concerning the outlook for Russian oil production has to be considered on three levels. The first is, what are the prospects for oil production itself? The second is, what is the likely impact of the changing revenue stream on the stability of the Russian government system, the Russian state system? And then the third level has to do with the connections between Russia as an energy producer and the world economy generally. I would say, first of all, in answer to one of the questions that you listed, the Russians are paying very close attention, on the oil side particularly, to what's going on in the rest of the world. The news of tight oil reached Moscow very quickly. The oil companies, we know from having talked to them, have been aware of the developments in the Bakken and so on within weeks and months of the actual events themselves. Now, have they drawn the lessons? Have they drawn the appropriate lessons? The fact that they continue to talk about the Bazhenov, as they do, the cat in the bag, suggests that in some respects they have been slow to perceive the actual important message. But at the same time, one has to make allowance for the fact that the perceptions in North America have been evolving very quickly, month by month, and the picture that I've given you of the unconventional conventionals is really only about a year old in the oil industry itself in the United States. So given all that, they have been following a moving target, and they've been following it very quickly and flexibly. Now, as to whether the tight oil revolution can happen in Russia, let me say only that the closest thing to a reality check that I've had was going to talk to the head of a small company called Ruspetra. And this is an American with long experience in Russia. He was part of the Yukos adventure a decade ago, and he knows the Russian territory. And he's developed this scrappy little independent in Russia. He said, look, my wellhead netback, what I get at the wellhead, is $22, given an oil price of 100. If the export price for Urals blend is $100 a barrel, what I get at the wellhead is $22. Everything else is taken off the top by the government in the form of taxes, basically, and in the form of high transportation tariffs. With $22, I cannot do tight oil. I can't do the fancy latest generation stuff. I cannot do multi-stage fracking. I do fracking. I do ordinary vanilla fracking from 10 years ago. I cannot do long extended reach horizontal wells. I do horizontal wells, but they're not 10 kilometers long. And I can't do the fancy microseismic stuff because I would have to go to Schlumberger or Halliburton and pay international prices. And on $22, I can't do that. Bottom line, moral of the story, if tight oil comes to Russia, it will not be the little guys like me who will bring it there. It will be the big companies or nobody. And so that brings you back then to the question marks about Rosneft and about the relationships between these big Russian companies and the Russian government and the quality of the fiscal and the regulatory environment.
Yeah, I would give a different picture on Caspian than what Thane is describing about Russia. Because the first thing, I mean, from the company perspectives, and this is very different than the investment climate in Russia, is that first thing, there's very few places around the world that allow you to book volumes. That still a company can come in with a PSA and book volumes, and this is very important. I know outside of North America, this is very important to investing in companies. So first thing, I mean, the whole structure of business, and certainly in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, to less extent in Turkmenistan, but that you can actually book the volumes and have a PSA is becoming, unfortunately, or fortunate, but rarer and rarer around the world. Second, the whole issue of sanctity of contracts. In the whole history of Azerbaijani production export, you haven't had any, one change in the contracts. There's been a sort of a whole ideology that this should be a very stable, business-friendly place. Kazakhstan, more zigzags on this issue, but still things that were manageable in the end of the day. Again, a very different picture than Russia or many other places around the world. You couldn't imagine what happened to Yukos or TK, BP. It could not happen in the Caspian. A very different situation. Also, the political goals of the producers. Again, talking about these landlocked producers that want multiple markets, that want to be linked to the West. It's their interest. It's not just a market. It's not just market driven. There's a very strong political interest. Just even today, there's a World Economic Forum event being held in Baku. Just to get more and more Western interest in their markets. I think the thing about being less thirsty for FDI and having more local leadership, that's a good thing. I mean, it actually shows how these places have produced and there's profits, and that they can actually have a more long-term goal and not, and things that are more stable. What has changed is the geopolitics. Again, sitting here in Washington, and Russia becoming more and more assertive and successfully assertive in the region. Iran becoming more bold in the region, the US less engaged, Europe more engaged, but like Stalin said about the Vatican, how many divisions does it have? So it's not really, it's not really clear how, on the geopolitical side, yes, but that's something that, again, Washington can make its choice.
Thank you.
Interesting question. And I think we have to make a difference here between oil and gas. Our session is supposed to be more about oil. And as far as oil is concerned, we can probably say that Russia, in this fantastic decade of 2000s, was a colossal overachiever with very moderate reserves. It was, in certain years, #1 global producer. As far as gas is concerned, and we'll have a special session on gas, they will probably disagree. Russia was an underachiever. And it's suddenly discovering that in the coming golden age of gas, if it is indeed coming, being an anathema to bureaucrats in Brussels, it may be a loser, having all these huge reserves. And how might that possibly happen? And the kind of mental adjustment starts with the point, you need to get real. You need somehow to get rid of the illusions and ambitions of the previous decade. You need to look more seriously at what's really happening in the energy market. Where are your strengths? Arctic is becoming a victim of this need to get real because too many things there were built on a very shaky foundations, where really dreams that should not probably come true in any foreseeable future. But the interesting point is, yes, there is a kind of political desire. We need to get real. And then you try, and you cannot. Because you start getting real, and you discover what it really means. That your revenues are going down, that the only way to go forward is to reform this and innovate that. And you cannot do that. And that's why Miller again and again comes with ideas, all this shale gas revolution is just a bubble. It's just a Hollywood and smoke and mirror. It's not serious. It's going to explode. And probably, again, shale gas revolution is not exactly a new thing. It was kind of going on for a few years, and it's time to really come with serious assessments, but they cannot. Because they come with this assessment, they put them on the table, and the picture is for Russia is becoming so bleak that the only reaction you can say is, no, we cannot accept these assessments, it's all Hollywood.
On this cheerful note, I think there are some folks with microphones, and I see one hand raised over here, and another there, and another there. And we have all of about 5 minutes, I think.
Hello, my name is Nicholas Boros. I'm a student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I went to a talk at Atlantic Council 2 weeks ago. They said that Russia will need to lower the taxes on the oil industry precisely for the reasons you were talking about. It's constraining the industry's ability to grow. But they also said that if they do that, then taxes will need to be raised on the gas industry to make up for the loss in revenues. Do you think this is likely? And what would the impact be on Russia's ability to flex its muscle in energy markets?
Thane, you want to take this?
Shall we collect?
Well, actually, what I'd like to do is to turn to my colleague, Matthew Sagers, who's sitting here, and who is, in fact, the great expert on the subject and has been working with the Russian government to try to design some answers to your questions.
That's exactly the plan. They've realized that the level of taxation on Russian oil really had become a big drag. And that was kind of universally recognized across everybody. However, at the same time, they said, we'll fix this slowly. It's going to be the picture. We'll keep the revenues for as long as we can. And at the same time, the finance ministry cast its eye around the rest of the economy looking for places, and the place where its eye rested was the gas industry. So therefore, we haven't got to the session yet, but they decided that they would raise gas prices domestically very rapidly. The bulk of that was going to be taken up with taxes that would go to basically offset decline on oil, and then also to basically meet all the new spending requirements that THANE talked about. But a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. They realized that, holy cow, if we raise the prices dramatically, right now we're in a battle royal with a variety of other competing forces. It's renewables in Europe, it's LNG, our gas might not be competitive anymore. And of course, the other issue that they realize is they forgot to also ask the consumers. If we raise gas prices dramatically, what happens to you guys? And it turned out that a lot of the big consumers basically can't take a big increase in gas. The period during the 2000s when gas prices basically doubled, the basically big consumers were able to absorb that because they were in a very favorable economic environment. And so now we're basically back at 6s and 7s. We've got to dramatically scale back all of the things we talked about, which means that the reform on Russian oil is going to go even more slowly. This is going to be the picture.
Thank you very much. Let's do this. Let's collect 2-3 questions, and then I think we'll have to wrap up. So I see 3 hands raised over here. Let's quickly 4 hands if we can squeeze them in.
Hello, Jill Tederick. I'm a fellow at CERES. I was wondering, this is a question primarily for Dr. BAEV, what you think the impact will be on the Arctic over the recent agreement between China and Russia to start developing the Arctic, form a partnership there.
Okay, there's one more hand over here.
Hello, Electra Sakalidu, student at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Professor SHAFFER, you mentioned that prices of gas prices in California do not affect European consumers. I was wondering, President Obama has reiterated many times that he has the ambition to sign a transatlantic free trade agreement with the European Union. What would the effect of potential gas exports to Europe be, and how would they affect the market pricing mechanisms and potentially the relationship between Europe and Russia in long-term contracts? Thank you.
And one more over here, and that'll be the last question, I think.
Amanda Dethridge, U.S. CERES Network. With regard to Caspian oil and gas, we've heard about Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, et cetera. And what about Iran, though? You alluded to it just briefly when you had a comment earlier. What role does it play, if any, and what impact will it have, if any?
Okay.
In what order?
Pavel, do you want to talk about?
All right. I'll try to be as brief as possible. Just a word on taxation. I think we need to remember that a big part of the kind of Putin's presidential ambition at the moment is not energy as such, but reindustrialization. That's something he tries to push forward very strongly. And that essentially requires low prices on gas and electricity. And the prices on gas in Russia are already higher, domestic prices, than in the United States. So raising taxes there really goes across that, that very strong political priority. As far as China, Russia, and the Arctic, I can say that there are a lot of worries in Russia about China's ambition in that region. Russia would generally much prefer to deal with the Arctic matters inside the kind of cozy circle of the Arctic Council, and in particular the 5 littoral states. But China is coming strong with its ambitions, and particularly as far as transportation is concerned. I don't think there is much future in developing energy resources there, because neither country has technology for that. But as far as using the navigation there, I think Russia is particularly worried about the fact that China might go there on its own, which would violate the sovereignty of the Northern Sea route. And the trends we have in the climate change are such that it indeed might become technically possible very soon. As far as the energy is concerned, I think Bobolo would talk you more about that, but I think Kovicta is a far more promising project for joint energy development than anything that can possibly be found in the Arctic.
Brenda?
Okay.
The country you didn't mention almost?
Okay. First thing on the potential impact of U.S. gas exports to Europe. It's a very important question. Yeah, I think that we have to always to remember that the price of gas first thing, the gas. You have to look at the history of gas prices in the United States, and we tend to think, oh wow, they're really, really low now, and they'll always stay, low. And actually, first thing just to remember that there were times that Henry Hub was a higher price than oil. So we have to remember the historical perspective, and that actually, as we move over, I believe that natural gas, we will be in the golden age of natural gas. So the 21st, just like the 20th century was the era of oil, 21st century will be the era of natural gas. And as we move more and more things over to natural gas, like transportation, then demand will go up, and of course, it's going to affect the prices. So we shouldn't assume the prices are going to just stay low inevitably, right? But at the same point, so when you think about the price of LNG imports, U.S. LNG imports to Europe, it's still higher than pipeline gas from Russia. We have sort of an anomaly. 2010, 2011, there was a lot of spot re-export from the United States to Europe that in certain places it brought down spot markets, and it put pressure on Russia. But 2012, that spot basically was eliminated. It was sort of this anomaly of suddenly the shale gas appearing, it wasn't planned for, and this gas being available. And you see that actually in 2012, the spot isn't affecting. Again, we have also this declining European demand for gas. So I think that U.S. exports will probably have a big impact on the U.K. Because they don't have the same amount of pipeline options that other continental European countries have. But still LNG is more expensive than pipeline gas, and so maybe it'll put some pressure on Russian prices, but by having these other options. And again, I think the debate here still isn't. I think we're at the beginning of the debate in the United States about how extensive these exports will be. On the question about Iran in the region and in oil and gas markets. I mean, I think Iran is also great. We could have a whole conference on Iran, maybe sometime. But I mean, Iran is an incredible. You see how politics does matter. Here's a country that sits on the second largest natural gas volumes in the world, or maybe with the new estimates about the United States, maybe it's changing, but maybe to third. But is a net natural gas importer. So this, or you can have when the largest gas field in the world is shared with Qatar. Qatar turns itself into the largest LNG producer in the world, and Iran doesn't have one LNG export, facility. So Iran in the region, it trades gas it supplies gas to Armenia and receives electricity from Armenia. It swaps here. But again, it's a net natural gas importer. Iran's goals have always been in terms of Caspian energy, have been to destabilize it, not because it wanted to control the volumes, not really because it wanted the pipeline projects to go through Iran, because this was never seriously on the table. It was never an option that Azerbaijan considered. But simply because, again, for those same general political goals that a country like Azerbaijan, for instance, that's so pro-Western, pro-American, and also the fact that Iran, the big question, Iran is a multi-ethnic state with a third of its population ethnic Azerbaijani. So their nightmare was a prosperous Azerbaijan on its northwest border and potential impact on its own Azerbaijani minority. So in general, their plan has always been to destabilize. Again, it's another sort of debunk a myth here. It's very, very, very in the fashion to say, well, that Iran tries to destabilize Azerbaijan because of its close relations with Israel. And actually, Iran has tried to destabilize Azerbaijan from 1992, from the beginning, from its inception, because of this ethnic issue, has nothing to do with the close relations between these countries.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. THANE, Brenda, Paul, thank you for a fascinating set of presentations. I think lunch is being served, and I see Ambassador Pascual is here to continue the conversation. So we'll wrap up here, and once again, thanks. Thanks to all of you.